sharing this on the book club LibGuide and the library's website. And the chat transcript will also be shared on the website. So keep that in mind as you type any comments into chat or as we unmute you. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties during the WebEx meeting, you may want to exit out and click the link and join back in. Or if your power goes out, we can send an email of the recording. And then please follow LSC-CyFair Library on social media so you can keep up with our events and programs. And then finally, if you enjoy this presentation, please take a few minutes on sometime later this week. I'll send an email with a survey link. And if you'll just take a few minutes to take that survey so I can collect information and see how we can improve these future virtual book clubs, that would be great. Okay, so now Bobby, Professor Robert O'Brien, he's going to be facilitating our discussion on The Women's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote by Elaine Weiss. And he is a LSC-CyFair history professor. And I want to mention that Bobby's research is referenced in the footnotes of The Women's Hour multiple times. And so I will let him tell you a little bit about that, and then we can start our discussion. All right. I'm handing the floor to you, Bobby.
Hi, thanks for coming. I've read this book several years ago, and we've been using it in our U2 survey classes, many of the professors at Lone Star, in light of the anniversary approaching the 100-year anniversary. So we started using it last year, and we're going to continue it this fall too. So I'm very curious about, I'm guessing most of you are from the community. So I've had multiple student reactions to this book, and most positive. But I'm curious about community members. So if anybody wants to jump in and give me some impressions, what they thought of the book.
Hey, Bobby, this is Rose. Can you hear me?
Everyone is unmuted. Bobby, do you want to restate your question?
Yeah, just curious, first impressions of the book, if you were able to read it or get through some of it. One comment I hear from students is the book is maybe too long.
It is long. Very detailed.
The book, it's long and it's detailed, but it is, for me, maybe I'm biased because I'm interested in this topic, but it was a page turner for me. The first time I read the book, I read it when it came out, and then I also listened to the audiobook after that, which I recommend. If you can't make it through the book, reading it, try the audiobook. It's fantastic. But for me, it was hard to put down. So curious.
Agree with Regina. I love the way it was written. Like, I didn't want to stop reading it, even though I did know, the end outcome. Before I started reading the book, I still just couldn't stop reading it.
Okay.
I connected to it and wanted to know what my grandmother, who was politically active in Iowa around 1920, what she did about this, because she's long gone, of course. It made me wonder what things looked like.
Of course, I think that's where Carrie Chapman Catt is from. I think she's from
Right.
So
my grandmother actually lived 10 miles from Spencer.
Oh, okay. Now, Regina mentioned some of my research. I've done research on Tennessee, especially the newspaper publishers who are mentioned in the book, Luke Lee and Edward Stallman. And Tennessee politics, I think, are very interesting. And one thing she doesn't get into too much, like, and add to the discussion is Tennessee politics became very divisive in the almost 20 years earlier when they decided to, or they proposed a state prohibition law. And a number of other states had already done this. And it tore Tennessee apart. People in neighborhoods, especially in the political world. And so she touches on some of it, but that's the backdrop to a lot of the divisiveness, including between the two newspaper publishers, Luke Lee and Edward Stallman. And if you've been watching the recent news with protests, if anybody saw in Nashville when they tore down the statue of a man named Edward Carmack, who was a newspaper editor for the Tennessean in the early part of the century, and he was adamantly against alcohol and he was supporting the prohibition movement, and he got into a duel right near the state capitol there, right near the Hermitage Hotel, and was killed. And it was not a duel like Hamilton and Burr, but basically people he was enemies with, he came across them on the street and they each drew their weapons. And Carmack became a martyr. And so that's kind of the backdrop. A lot of the politics is a lot of it's over the prohibition. Some southern states did it very quickly, but Tennessee it took a while for them to pass their state law. And there was still a lot of animosity towards that law. So that's some of the backdrop on the Tennessee politics. What did you think of the anti-suffrage movement? Students are always fascinated by that when we discuss the book. Josephine Peterson and her group.
I know for me, reading about the anti-suffrage movement, it's super fascinating. So I'm curious to hear if anyone did any of their own research outside of reading this book on the anti-suffrage movement and arguments. And I do have everyone unmuted, so you can mute yourself back, or if you want to contribute to the discussion, go for it.
I think I find myself a little conflicted as an anti-suffrage person. I think I can see their viewpoint, but it's very difficult because when you don't have rights of voting and you are the ones that are suffering, I guess, it's hard to say that what's more important, your community structure or voting. And so I can see where they were trying to hold on to their heritage and their culture, and they thought that this would be it would negatively impact, and maybe it has, I don't know, but I guess I can see their point of view. It is interesting.
What do you mean by heritage? Could you hear me? Do you mean the Southern heritage with Reconstruction and segregation and hello?
Marcia, I think that question was directed at you.
Oh, I didn't answer that, but I was raised in Iowa, and so I don't understand the whole Southern, the Southern mother, woman at the hearth, raising the children, no voice. I don't understand that, but it was definitely a characteristic of the time. So.
Okay. Some of it goes maybe back to 19th century, putting especially Southern women on a pedestal, especially before the Civil War. the idea that Southern womanhood needs to be protected, and that extends after the war, during Reconstruction and afterwards, and is partially what motivated lynchings too. The idea that white women are being attacked by black men, of course, which most times was false, but it was used as motivation. So I think that's underlining some of what Pearson's doing. She's also religiously motivated. What about the politicians in Tennessee, the Governor Roberts? What's his stand on women's suffrage? Anybody?
I'm afraid I didn't get very far in the book, but he seemed like he went whichever the wind was blowing.
Yes. He's very politically motivated. He's afraid to commit, and being pushed definitely by the suffrage organizations and pushed by some of the national politicians too. Did you get far enough to read about because it's a presidential year or presidential election year,
Right.
and you have Cox the Democrat running against Harding, the Republican, and Cox is definitely pushing suffrage, whereas Harding is wanting to say much. He's not wanting to commit. He's feeling like he can win, but his handlers are telling him not to be controversial, not to, step out and support suffrage. Don't be emphatic about it. So the Democrats seem to be more for it. You're seeing that in Tennessee and also in, on the national scene. And of course, Wilson, the current president, takes a long time to endorse it too. And you're familiar with the picketing of the White House and Alice Paul. One thing I often ask students is, analyze the two suffrage groups, the NAWSA, Kat's group, and then the National Women's Party, Paul's group. I often ask them, who do you think was more effective with this movement?
Let me unmute everyone. I just want to add that I think that's a great question. But I know when I was pursuing my undergraduate degree, I had a difficult time keeping track of the different associations once they sprung up and split off. So, Professor O'Brien, how do you tell students to make sense of that, to keep track of that when they're looking at the different associations and their effectiveness?
Well, there's two in the after Civil War. There's one split, and then there's a later split, which this book focuses on, the Cat and Paul. The first split is over, and she touches on it some in the early chapters when she looks at Stanton and Anthony, and it's the women's movement, or the suffrage movement gets split because the 15th Amendment focuses on race. It doesn't deal with gender. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others are very angry about that. They supported black male suffrage, but they wanted to be included too. And for a number of reasons, they're told, it's not your time, you're going to have to wait. And so they withdrew their support from the 15th Amendment. and it led to a split. Lucy Stone and others started the American Women's Suffrage Association. You also had the National. So the movement was split for about 20 years or so. And most historians believe that split slowed down the movement. Stone's group was saying, we're going to fight for a 16th Amendment, which will be women. And of course, we know it doesn't come at 16, it's 19. It's going to take another 40 years or so. And so these women, none of these women lived to see the 19th Amendment passed. Eventually, what happens in the 1890s is the AWSA and the NWSA join back together. And with the blessing, actually, Anthony and Stanton are still alive, and they give their blessing to it. It created a lot of bickering, and a lot when groups argue about strategy. A lot of times it gets personal, and that's what was happening. And so it did slow down the movement. And so under Carrie Chapman Catt, as it moves into the 20th century, the movement starts to pick up a lot of steam. And she touches on the son of Alice Paul. Paul's a fascinating figure. She's very well educated, then works on her graduate degree in England, and participates in the suffrage movement there with the Pankhursts. And they are much more aggressive in England, where they will throw bricks through the window of a member of Parliament's house, with a message about women's suffrage. They're much more aggressive in their marching. And then when they're arrested, they go on hunger strikes in the jails. And so Alice Paul picks up on all this and participates in it. And she brings it back to the United States. And she joins up with the NAWSA, but she's getting frustrated with them. She doesn't think they're moving quickly enough. She doesn't think they're aggressive enough. So that leads to the split in the teens, 19 teens, where Paul's group breaks off the National Women's Party. And I often ask students, sometimes I have them write a paper on it. You got to pick one or the other. Which organization are you going to be a member of, and and why? And it's interesting. It's usually about a 50-50 split in a class, and students kind of represent some of the views of the time period, where they thought Paul's group was. Students who pick NAWSA think Paul's group is too aggressive, that she's hurting the movement overall as opposed to helping it. And others, I think, can relate to her and say, the time is now and you've got to be aggressive. And so it's interesting. You can kind of find out about how students see things. I think it would probably translate into their modern views on injustice too.
And Bobby, I just wanted to point out that it's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of people thought Paul was being too aggressive, and when people find out that she was a pacifist and a Quaker, and then but she's also cast as this radical suffragist, and the contrast between her religious beliefs and then her willingness to I think she states at one point in the book that she's willing to fight for the vote if she has to, if it comes to that. So do your students ever bring that up, her religious background?
Yes, some of them, they talk about her pacifism. They say others, I think that they see that it's maybe just in name only. She's saying that and she can't control all members of the NWP, and when they're protesting in front of the White House, or they're going on their hunger strikes in jail, and they face abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse while they're in jail, they're kind of a forerunner of what we'll see with the later civil rights movement. They're this thing in a way, but they're not. They're trying to stop people, security guards or police officers from feeding them, and resisting in that way. But they're not running up and punching police officers And I'm not sure if they're throwing bricks through windows of Congress people. Like in England, it was more militant. So I think maybe Paul tones it down a little bit, but their presence is more forceful. And what I often tell students is, I don't think you needed both groups to do it. It's interesting what I said a few minutes ago. The split of the 19th century hurt the movement, whereas I think this split helps, because the proof is it does get ratified in 1920, and I liken it. It might not be the best analogy, but it helps students relate to it. It's kind of like good cop, bad cop. And who does the public, and especially politicians, see as the bad cop? Who would you think? Who to them is the bad cop? Who do they fear the most?
NWP.
Yes, yeah, definitely they fear the Alice Paul's groups the most. Because Paul's starting to talk about equal rights. So what happens with some of the politicians is they start listening and paying attention more to Kat and her group. And it's a bigger group too. Always the more Paul's group is definitely more radical. And so, can people hear me? I see Regina's muted. She might have got booted out.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So Paul's group is definitely seen as more radical, and politicians fear having to deal with her. They'd rather deal with Kat, who in some ways seems to emphasize feminine qualities more than Paul's group. And if you picked up on the war, it's a time period with incredible things going on, or monumental events. World War I, starts in 1914. U.S. enters in 1917. And we often forget a lot of the public wasn't very supportive or didn't really understand why the U.S. entered that war. There was a lot of people who thought maybe side with Germany, or a lot of people, especially immigrants, just stay out of it. And Kat is actually a pacifist too. And she begrudgingly supports the war effort. Why do you think she does that?
Well,
Everyone's unmuted.
doesn't she hope that if they stop demonstrating and support the war effort, that Wilson will back the amendment?
Yeah. She's trying to play the political game, even though she herself doesn't really support the war. She's a pacifist, but she has her group behind it and help out in some ways with activities once the U.S. enters the war. And Paul's group is vehemently against it. And I often ask students that, do you think had a better approach or a more realistic view of the war? And most students say they agree with Kat, that Kat is trying to go along with the flow, and that's probably more pragmatic. But sometimes students say that they admire Paul because she stuck to her guns. I'm a pacifist and I don't agree with this war either. But her group is a smaller group. But that will also lead to them being seen as more radical too, because they don't openly support war. Whereas most Americans come in line, by the end of 1970s, and before that, are very much in favor of the war. And that's the government propaganda machine too, does a good job convincing the American public it's the right war against the right enemy. That's another book or another discussion.
Right. Molly, were you trying to add something?
No, I was the one that was talking, and then you muted me, and I couldn't respond.
All right. Would you like to?
No, it's past that point. That's okay.
All right. So, just moving forward with the discussion, if you are muted and you'd like to respond and I haven't unmuted you, just go ahead and click on that icon to raise your hand.
Oh, okay.
All right. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Bobby.
Okay. Who, based on what we've been talking about, who do you see as more effective in Tennessee? Tennessee becomes the state of the hour. It's seen as the last hope for this amendment to be ratified, the 36th state. Approach in the state is more effective.
Everyone's unmuted.
Wouldn't that be more effective because
Effective in Tennessee, because that's what the book focuses on.
So, to clarify, Bobby, are you asking which organization is more effective?
Yes, I'm sorry. Which is it? And let me preface this with another question. Alice Paul does not go to Tennessee. Why doesn't she do that? Because Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of the NAWSA, is very active in Tennessee. Alice Paul never gets on a train and goes down to Nashville. So why not? And then we go back to the other question.
Everyone is unmuted.
Kat was the one that was politically favored, and she was working with Wilson, right?
I couldn't hear everything you said. Kat was working.
Wasn't she the one that was involved with the president?
I couldn't. I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Okay, let me see if I can just unmute Molly so she can answer. I'm going to mute everyone and then Molly, one moment. Okay, now go ahead.
Isn't she the one that is more politically in favor of politicians? Kat, meaning?
I mean, working with politicians?
Right.
Yes. That could be part of it. Paul doesn't work as much behind the scenes, with lobbying. It's also because she's such a lightning rod. By this point, she's known nationally, and she's associated by much of the public as this radical. And so she fears that the movement, or that if she goes to Tennessee, there'll be too much focus on her personality, her activities, and her leadership. He doesn't want the focus on her. She wants Tennessee to ratify suffrage. So I see that as very noble, where, many leaders would want to be there on the scene, maybe basking in the glory, but she makes the decision not to go down because she doesn't want it to be about her. She fears it would hurt the ratification process in Tennessee. So she sends others, and she's working with others in Tennessee. And Sue Shelton White is probably the one that does the most for her. And she's interesting because she was originally an NAWSA member, and that leadership sees her as a traitor and I guess a spy too, because she informed Paul and other leadership of NWP about NAWSA tactics, sometimes, or strategies, and in some ways, I guess, was a spy, but that's not why she joined NWP. Like Paul, thought the movement was moving too slowly. So
Bobby, I have a question since you brought up strategies. When your students are reading this book, are they ever surprised to learn about some of these suffragist strategies and compare them to what's going on right now, what they're reading in the headlines, seeing on television. Do they ever comment on that? Are they shocked by their strategies?
They definitely see parallels. They are impressed with both movements are pretty well organized, and they can see in present day organization and also in the idea in getting the word out to the press, obviously today. And I actually asked students a question: if you take a 21st century piece of technology with you back to 1920, what would it be? How would you use it as a member of the NWP or the NAWSA? And most of them pick like the internet, and they could see both of those groups doing wonderful things with the internet to get the word out.
I mean, that's a great question. That's a fantastic question, and we should ask everyone here to give their answer on that. But do they talk about how Carrie utilized the headlines and the print media versus how Paul utilized Paul? She had great public relations skills. She may not have been as diplomatic as Carrie, but do they ever comment on that? Because in a sense, that was their internet. That was they were using the technology of the time to get their
that's what they say. How both were using the press and looking to get a certain story done, or looking to get to a certain politician, and they see the internet would help them even, especially like email, the instant communication. It's a time period where communication is pretty quick. The telegram is utilized a lot, and if you look in some of her notes, some of my research in the time period too is a lot of it's telegrams. Sometimes people send telegrams that are 3 pages long, and a page is probably about half the size of a 1/2 by 11. Telegrams could get expensive, I guess, once they get hundreds of words. But so it's not quite the communication we have today, obviously, but they definitely see the connection between how they use the press and how it could be used, how it's done today, too. That you need to get the word out, and you need to get your version of the story to convince people.
Can we pose that question to our attendees? Did everyone, if you were asked the same question, what piece of technology would you bring with you? Would it be the internet, or did anyone have any other answers for that? I'm curious to know what it would be and why. And everyone is unmuted.
I definitely took the internet just for spreading the word and ideas and planning and what have you.
Right.
What about television?
I don't think the television is as effective as social media or the internet.
Yeah, students would say. Some say television. They say, especially, I guess, pick on my age group, that older people maybe gravitate towards television more than the internet. Some students talk about that too.
You can watch television on the internet.
I'm sorry?
So you can watch television on the internet.
Yeah. Now,
right.
Of course,
so
today it's complicated. The internet has everything. It's replacing everything.
Right.
Well,
one thing that
I'm sorry,
students often bring up is the field work, where they go out to communities, to some of the politicians in other towns in Tennessee, and go some to the general public. They organize themselves and go to key areas where they think if they can influence a certain group in a town, that it could then translate to them pushing the legislators back in Nashville to pass to ratify the amendment. And the NWP was very organized with it. And some of the women are not too successful, but others do get attention. And students often translate that today to people going door to door, or people going down to a courthouse and protesting. Whereas you could talk about the electronic media, or print media, but the face-to-face in some ways is the best method. So some students are very interested in that, the idea of going. She calls Weiss calls field work.
Right. I do have another question. For those of you who were able to read the entire book, or if you've watched the vote on PBS, and Bobby, your students, are they shocked when they read about all of the other parallels surrounding the final 2 years, the final push for the women's suffrage movement, as far as what's going on after World War I and the pandemic? Just in the progressive reforms, are they shocked about how similar it sounds to what we are experiencing right now?
Yeah, because the pandemic, our current pandemic, is very new. In my US1 class, I talk about the pandemics brought over from Europe, especially smallpox. And the students, I have them read an article that looks at what the Native Americans went through in the centuries after Columbus. And they definitely see parallels, because sometimes the Indians, many times, did not quarantine. They didn't understand about that. And they made it worse by gathering around sick people. And that helped to spread it. And I haven't, when I taught in the spring was the last time I taught the US2 class. And we did talk some about the World War I, or the influenza of 1918, 1919 a little bit. We were kind of past that when the pandemic really hit. I went back and referenced it a little bit. So, and I've yet to teach, definitely in the fall, we're going to make a lot of connections to it. And I'll probably have them read an article on the 1918, 1919 influenza. So there's, yeah, it seems like history's repeating itself a lot. And also there's riots in regards to into race, 1919, 1920. Most of it's whites going into black neighborhoods and burning, destroying. And there's some blacks stepping up and fighting back against it. And you have the NAACP, of course. But today, of course, we see a much active movement for racial equality. So, or you also, another parallel would be in the time period of radicals or communists are painted as causing all the problems. As Russian Revolution has just taken place, so there's a fear that's developing of communism and of socialism. It's already existed. 1919, 1920 has the first Red Scare, and students have more trouble relating to that, I think, because most of them were born when the Cold War ended, and so they have not experienced, what we have, as far as the arms race, and so, even though it's still going on, but so I think the younger generations don't quite have that same fear of communism that's existed in America from 1920 to into the 1990s. So they have more trouble relating to that. But I think I'm digressing here. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm curious, jumping back to the anti-suffrage movement, if you want to call it that. I'm curious to know what everyone thought about the arguments that the anti-suffragists put forth. Did anyone have any? Were you shocked? Did you identify with their fears? I think we may have briefly, said something about this at the beginning of the discussion, but I'm always curious to know if anyone feels swayed by those arguments, or sympathizes with those arguments. No judgment here, so everyone's unmuted.
Well, I only read the beginning, and in fact, I was just reading before we got on, and I found, especially what the men were saying, to be offensive, and that I needed to be cared for. And I mean, obviously, I wouldn't do very well to live then.
Right.
I mean, there's because women could barely own property. In some places, could not even own property. And anyway, I couldn't understand why people would feel that way, but I guess
right.
That's just me.
And it's interesting that you look at the propaganda from that period and the arguments, the anti-suffrage arguments, and they're all rooted in gendered stereotypes, and a lot of those gendered stereotypes are what people would sometimes cling to as their heritage. So it was so complex how people felt about this, and I would love to read, or if anyone has a recommendation for a great paper, or Bobby, something you've read that goes into more detail about the anti-suffrage movement and arguments. I mean, I read a lot in my research, but when I was putting together the list for the book club, I was trying to find a book that focuses on the anti-suffrage argument that would be accessible to everyone, and I didn't find anything. So if anyone has any recommendations, or you've stumbled across something in your research, please drop it in the comments or shoot me an email, because I'd love to know.
I think there's a book, Pearson, if I remember right. I think there's been stuff done on her, and she's the focal point of this movement.
Oh, great.
I don't think she ever marries, if I'm right. She still lived with her parents, and she's older, and she's been fighting this cause for a long time. Most students, like what the one participant was just saying, some of them are shocked, especially the women. Some are offended by it. Some will say that they are religious, go to church, but they don't agree with this idea that women should be subservient to men, and that women's place is only the home. It's eye-opening for some women. I've had some women students, and especially I think they're probably a little bit older, not like a 20-year-old student, but they'll thank me afterwards and say they're saving this book was eye-opening for them, and very appreciative of what these women did, the suffrage movement itself. If she Weiss touches on it at the end, but even if you haven't gotten to the end, I think it's in the not the epilogue, but the last chapter, kind of looking at what happens with the 1920 election, and then moves through, looks at different things in the later 20th century. Something I think some of you probably remember is the Equal Rights Amendment fight for that. I think it first proposed by Congress 1969, picks up a lot of steam in the early 70s, gets 35 states, I believe, and then never gets any more to vote for it. It needed 38, because by this point there's 50 states. And I think there's a lot of parallels. Students will pick up on this when we get to the later time period. The anti-ERA movement, Stop ERA, with Phyllis Schlafly, is in some ways she seems to be connected to Pearson in a way, her movement, whereas they're trying to uphold the traditional home, and they see now and other women's organizations as trying to tear it down and forcing them to go back to, or forcing them to go work where they don't want to have to do that, and that if ERA passes, it's actually going to take rights away as opposed to increase rights for women. So a lot of the same arguments are kind of made that was made in the 19-teens or made in the 1970s. So you're probably more familiar with that. So some of you probably lived through that. And I remember it as a child, that movement. And Hulu had a great dramatic series, Mrs. America. I highly recommend it. If anybody has Hulu.
Well, I'll probably send a link out about that, but Kate Blanchett is spot on embodying Phyllis Schlafly. It is fantastic.
It's frightening in a way. It seems like she's walked into your living room when you're watching it.
Right.
Yeah, it's great performances. The woman who plays Gloria Steinem is very good too.
Yes.
And Bella Abzug, they're all in it. I think it does a great job showing all these different viewpoints, because the ERA movement is split too, which is something women were facing with the suffrage movement, because there's so many different interest groups. There's African Americans, Latinos, gay and lesbian, and so all these groups want a seat at the table, and so the ERA movement is much more complex, I think, than the Stop ERA movement. I always tell students it's much easier to defeat an amendment. There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of amendments that have been defeated because you can't, that final hurdle of getting 3/4 of the states to ratify is very difficult. And Phyllis Schlafly realized that, and just focus on key states. All she needed was 13. I'm doing my math right. Yeah, 13. They need
I have everyone unmuted. And I'm just curious if anyone has already viewed the Hulu series that Ryan mentioned, Miss America. Has anyone had a chance to watch that yet?
No.
Okay, definitely add that too. I'm not sure if all the episodes have aired yet or if they're available yet.
They have. Yeah.
I can't remember.
Hulu, I think it was like 8 episodes.
Okay, right.
Each episode kind of takes a different perspective. So it's pretty historically accurate. Obviously, private conversations are dramatized, but it's pretty spot on with a lot of the things they show happening. And the last episodes is got the local angle. It deals with the women's conference. I think it's 1977, which was in Houston, and it's a whole episode about it. Although it focuses on a few fictional characters in that episode, but it portrays really what was happening. So I found that interesting too. I would highly recommend that. But back to what I was saying, there's definitely parallels between Schlafly and even earlier women's leaders who did not want suffrage. And by that I mean, and I'm not sure if she's mentioned in this book, but she'll be mentioned in a lot of other suffrage books that focus on the 19th century, is Catherine Beecher. She is the half-sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Catherine Beecher's older. And she was actually one of the most famous women before the Civil War because she wrote books, did lectures, and she did not support the beginnings of the women's rights movement with Seneca Falls, and did not support suffrage either. She thought women's place should be in the home, and that's what her books focused on. She talked about women's role in the private sphere. And she never married, but was able to support herself because she was a writer and a lecturer. Actually had a pretty good living. And students often find her hypocritical because she's telling women what to do, but she herself is living a life as an independent woman. and students often make the same connection with Schlafly too, where she's telling women really the home might be the better place for you, but she herself is very active politically, writing books, speeches, was very interested in the Cold War, very much a staunch anti-communist, and made money and made a name doing all that. And often shows a great political cartoon that shows Schlafly, her hand being raised, how she is done all this stuff and led a very independent life. And the last line of the cartoon says she emphasizes women should stay in the home, and so students look at that and go, "This woman seems very hypocritical." But I think there is a little more complexity to Schlafly, and the Hulu series I think brings that out. But back to your question of earlier, is kind of the parallels. I see parallels in the women's movement of the 19th century, early 20th century, and 1970s, and maybe even some today too. There's another book that we've been reading about women, African American women leading, helping with the civil rights movement, and it focuses on the violence towards African American women and how they stood up to it, starting with Rosa Parks. And this is well before the bus boycott. It was in the 1940s. And students see parallels from that to the Me Too movement of today. So there's issues that women are definitely facing.
I'm always curious. Do your students find it difficult to grasp the lag between actually having a constitutional amendment and then the time it takes to actually change the culture for it to go into effect in society? So many people think, okay, women, they fought and they won the right to vote, and then everything was roses afterwards.
Yeah, hunky dory.
That wasn't the case.
They, in some ways, I think for the younger students of today, it's a little harder to appreciate because they live in a much different world, even in the 1970s. Some of them start to grasp that these women from the past 100 years, their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents have paved a road for them where they have much opportunity. And some see that they don't think women are discriminated against at all today because they think they can go to college, they can pick whatever career they want. It's usually the older student who will tell them, who's been out in the work world, who's faced discrimination, who's faced sexual harassment. And sometimes it leads to interesting discussions between generational. Because the younger student definitely lives in a more open society towards women, but there's still issues and problems there. And sometimes the younger ones don't have the life experience to talk about that. Not sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. That was great. I mean, does anyone else have any thoughts about that question or response? Or anything we may have touched on that?
I often tell students in any history class that change comes slowly. It's one thing to, like what you're saying, pass a law, pass an amendment. It's another to enforce it. And with that, the cultural change, the societal change comes very slow. And what all students, and most agree, and some bring it up before I bring it up, education's the key. Education has led to people being more open and more accepting. And I tell the current group of students, the ones that are in their teens still, you're the most open generation, most tolerant generation I think that's ever existed in the United States. And I said that that's a good thing. I said my generation is much less tolerant, much less accepting in a way.
The other side of that is you can look at it as, Schlafly was an extremely educated woman, and Pearson was extremely educated for her time, but they were still opposed to women's voting rights. So does anyone ever make a comment about, if they're reading about an educated woman who is against voting rights or anything like, the Equal Rights Amendment? Have you ever had anyone comment on that?
Yeah, they understand it, or some see it as hypocritical. They see these women as roadblocks in a way towards progress.
I'm curious to know everyone's thoughts on that. When we think of, education making people more open-minded, more progressive-minded, or, as an equalizer, and then encounter people, on the news and the headlines, books in person that are educated, that have PhDs, or, they have expertise in some area, but they are against something as basic as like the ERA. Has anyone experienced someone like that, or are you like that? I'm just curious to know people's thoughts on that. And I have everyone unmuted. What was that? Was that Marcia?
No, it wasn't Marcia.
Okay, hold on. I think Molly, or let me see. I'm going to unmute everyone again. There we go. Everyone is unmuted. If you wish to be muted, you can mute her. Anyone have any thoughts?
I have a thought for you. This is Angela Paul. Hi, Bobby.
Hey, Angela.
It wasn't me that was talking before, but last summer I attended an institute at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and we were studying the Holocaust. And one of the conversations we had was about the role of education, because all of the attendees were educators. And we were talking about the role of education and how the people who came up with the final solution and the attempt to kill, murder Jewish, the European Jewry was all educated. They all had advanced degrees. And we discussed the role of education in, how as educators, we tend to believe that education can solve all the problems, and that is not necessarily true. And so how is it that we can, as educators, how we can encourage our students to both learn the information and also use that in a positive way?
That's a great.
Yeah, that's a tough question in many ways, because you can, it's cliche, lead the horse to water, but it's going to be up to them how they use it. I think each generation has a segment that is just not interested in things politically, just doesn't see things. I don't want to say doesn't care about the issues, but maybe even doesn't vote. And it's often they say that about younger people, but there's a lot of older people that don't vote too. That's the idea of how do you motivate them to take things beyond the classroom is a tough one. There's only so much we can do as educators. One thing I try to do in my class, and I think you've definitely done it too, Angela, is send them out to something in the community to see, to something that's hands-on, whether it's visiting a different part of the city, going to a museum, or going to some event that takes them beyond the classroom. And some of the students that I've done that with over the years has sparked an interest in a topic and made them, if not politically active, at least interested in reading more about it and maybe participating in that activity after the semester ends. I've had students come back to me and say they've taken an interest in something. That's probably just a small group of students that have reacted that way.
I mean, it's difficult. How do you inspire students to be more civically engaged? How do you show them that their vote does make a difference, that it matters? Why it's so important to get out there and vote and to educate yourself on the issues. Do students ever say or state in class that, you know, their vote or one vote doesn't matter? I'm curious about that aspect of it.
I've heard that. Yeah, I hear that, if not every semester, you know, times a year, and I'll definitely hear it in the fall, you know, since we have a presidential election coming up, especially when you live in Texas, where it's been a long time since a Democrat has won this state. Maybe Johnson, I think. Angela, I can't quite remember. But so in discussions about the Electoral College and such, and it's the same, you know, if you live in California or, you know, most states, you know, we know who's going to win it. It's just those handful of swing states. Ohio, by the way, has been a swing state forever since the 19th century. I guess Florida has been a swing state for a long time too. So, in some ways, the system kind of has them down, the way the whole election process, you know, plays out. Can I ask another question? I guess back to the book. Okay. If you got to the last chapter, this is a lot of times the final question I ask students, where she goes beyond. She starts with the election, because the election, the amendment gets ratified in August of 1920, and several months later you have the first presidential election where women in every state, all 48 states, can vote. Because before that, I think there were about 20 states that had passed suffrage on the state level, you know, in their state constitutions. And so now you have women across the board. And students often see this chapter as kind of depressing in a way, because African American women, and one of my criticisms of the book, she doesn't look enough at African American women's roles in suffrage. She talks some about some of the people in Tennessee and some of the people on the national level, but not too much. The most discussion might be in this last chapter, where African American women were intimidated from not voting, and that's of course existed in the South with for African American men have been facing that, you know, since the 1870s, 1880s, and it's kind of disheartening to see all the and violence was used in some places to stop African Americans, including women, from voting. And she looks at how things change slowly. It's what we were talking about earlier. And historians and or political scientists have gone back and looked. One of the criticisms of women voting was going to be women were going to change the political landscape, make it too radical. But most of the studies, I think, show that most women were married and most voted the way their husband voted. So it didn't really change the political landscape. I think there's probably more discrepancy today. I think women are more independent and don't always vote the same way their husband does, but probably the majority do. Couples, you know, like couples usually marry because they have like views, so they usually probably vote for in a similar way. But there's definitely more of a difference between how women overall vote as opposed to men in today's world. So, but they find the chapter kind of depressing because things seem to move, like what you were talking about. These cultural changes, things seem to be moving very, very slowly. After this, Alice Paul, it references and introduces an equal rights amendment several years after the suffrage movement passes, and tries for decades to get Congress to take it up, and it doesn't go anywhere. And it finally does, when we mentioned the late 60s, and of course in the 70s it goes to the states. And Alice Paul was still alive, and so some referred to it as the Alice Paul Amendment. They took basically the same amendment that she had written. And Susan Shelton White helps her with that in the 1920s. I know we've gone beyond our time. I know I joined late, but
So I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you wish to remain muted, just go ahead and mute your mic. So what was your last question there, Bobby? To restate.
No, I was just talking about how the change comes slowly and
shouldn't be arrested.
Okay.
Mostly people aren't saying that dangerous treatment. It's just not effective and therefore a distraction.
Well, and that's what I said. I guess they finished this. And that's what they said.
Who is that, Amy?
I think someone was trying to get an answer through there. She may have been disconnected. I don't see Amy on our list anymore.
Okay.
Did anyone else have any comments? Gail, I see you unmuted, and Marcia. And Lynn.
What do you recommend next?
I'm going to say the next book in our Suffrage Centennial series.
It's a book about Alice Paul and Woodrow Wilson. So it focuses on the National Women's Party.
Thank you.
And looks at Paul, her education, her time in England, and then when she comes back, and breaks from the NAWSA.
Right. And I just want to mention that if you can still see my screen, you'll see the book list. And for our next book club, we are collaborating with Books Without Borders. So Thursday, August 20th at 1 p.m., we will be discussing Mr. President, How Long Must We Wait by Tina Cassidy. There are both physical and digital copies in the Harris County Public Library and Houston Public Library catalog. Now this is, if you were intimidated by the length of The Woman's Hour, this book is a fourth of that. Maybe a third of that. It's much shorter.
Yeah, it's much shorter.
But it's just as interesting. And I want to point out in the emails I sent with the links to the LibGuide, the LibGuide is still very much a work in progress. I'm updating it daily, but I will have all the information for the Tina Cassidy book for August's book club up by the end of the week. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. And I'll send another email out. Sorry, Bobby, didn't mean to take the floor from you there, but
oh no, it's okay.
We still have some time left for our WebEx meeting before we're kicked out. So does anybody have any final thoughts or comments they want to make about the book? And I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone.
Well, they reminded me of AOC and Nancy Pelosi.
That's an interesting observation.
I mean, yeah.
Alice Paul?
Yes. She's an early AOC.
There wouldn't be an AOC without Alice Paul, probably.
Exactly. That's an interesting observation. I don't think I'd thought of that. I'd seen that parallel. Yeah.
Well, it makes you appreciate AOC if you didn't, because she does make, more moderate people look more moderate, which is how I thought I contrasted her with Alice Paul when they said she makes person more agreeable, and so.
Yeah, I see that.
Well, this is separate, but will you send out, now that you have us signed up, will you send an email every time with the link?
Yes, I will be sending an email with the links to everything and email reminders the week of and the day before and day of our upcoming meetings. Please feel free to share those links and that information with your friends. This is open to students and to the public. I do want to give another plug for PBS The Vote. It's a 2-part series, free on PBS app. Please watch that if you haven't already, or tell your friends. You can join in on any of the book club sessions without having read the book or finished the book if you want to learn more or just participate in the discussion, or maybe you're already an expert on the suffrage movement. So I will say my final piece about the book, reading this book, and I was following the author and waiting to get my hands on an advanced reader copy of this book before it was published. And I remember thinking, like so many other people, that, when this book comes out and when we celebrate the centennial, we are going to be celebrating this and reading this book while we have our first female president. And I know that a lot of these books that were published to celebrate the suffrage centennial were written with maybe that idea or that hope in mind. So I will say, reading some of these, it's kind of bittersweet, but all of the books on the list are fascinating. So hopefully they won't make you feel a little bit, feel sad with that in mind. So, Bobby, is there anything else you'd like to recommend for further reading or viewing?
You've got a good list of the books in this series. So there's not many books on African American women.
Right.
I can't remember the last time a biography's been done about Cat too. I think more on some of the individual figures. There is one book, I think, Sue Shelton White. It was done decades ago. So I think some of these other women need a fresh look.
Right.
And women in Texas, some Latino women who are part of the suffrage movement. There's not been too much. There's been some academic journal articles. There might be maybe one book. So definitely more needs to be done, and by historians.
Exactly.
I do have a few photos of the Hermitage. Do you want me to?
Yes, please. I think
them?
I can stop sharing my screen so I can let you share your screen. Okay, there we go. So if you want to remind everyone about the Hotel Hermitage.
Yeah. This is the Hermitage. I don't know. Can people see the first photo?
No.
No. Well, the Hermitage Hotel, the Hermitage name comes from Andrew Jackson's estate, which was it was east of Nashville. And then so this hotel opened up early 20th century, and it was state-of-the-art hotel for 1920. And this is where suffrage leaders and anti-suffrage leaders were staying as they came into Nashville. And they both used meeting rooms in this building, and it became basically ground zero for both sides of the debate. And this is where they did all their planning. And it's a beautiful hotel. It's been restored a lot in the last few decades. Can people see now?
So I'm not seeing anything on my screen. At the top of your screen, do you see where the option is to share your screen?
I'm looking.
So at the very top, if you hover there, you'll see a menu. Drop down and share your screen.
I don't see a menu. Let's see.
And you might have to exit your full screen view.
I'm not on full screen. I've got the window squeezed down.
Okay, so
is there
at the top of your screen, do you see where it says Cisco WebEx Events Hide Menu Bar?
I see you as host. It's that. Oh, is there a little floating panel here? No.
Yeah, there's a floating panel at the top where you can see File, Edit, Share, View. And you are also listed as one of the panelists, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, I see myself as panelist. Okay. I just have the video and the microphone. I don't. You have your polling coordinator.
So.
I'm sorry. I should have looked about this before. I told you I was gonna, and I didn't.
It's okay.
I'm not sure how to do this.
So, I mean, you can email them to me really fast, or if you don't mind, I can include them on the LibGuide page for today's session.
Well, I'll just say it's a beautiful building. I have some pictures of the interior. And I don't have pictures of, but there's little plaques in front of some of the rooms that were used. And there's still guest rooms. People can stay. And the author talks about this, where she stayed in Carrie Chapman Catt's room. She was so tickled to death to be able to do that. And the other thing it's known for, in the late 20s, early 30s, they redesigned their bathrooms, the public bathrooms, in the lobby. And those bathrooms were redone, I guess, in the last few decades. And they've been used for music. I have some pictures of the bathroom, which sounds like, what? Why is he showing pictures of a bathroom? It's this Art Deco green that's quite unusual. I had some photos of that too. And the hotel is, behind the hotel is the state capitol building. It's 2 blocks away. And I had a picture or two of the front, I guess. So I'm sorry, that's my description. I apologize for not being able to show that. Nothing earth shattering, but if you ever get a chance to stay in Nashville, it's a great place to stay. They've done a good job renovating it in the last few decades. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Anything else? Oh, you're muted. Are you muted?
Thanks, Bobby. Didn't realize I was muted. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up. Professor O'Brien, thank you so much. We are so glad you were able to make it into the meeting.
I apologize. It's the first time I had that problem. It must have been the browser. Would not work.
Difficulties are to be expected, so I'd let everyone know. So thank you for those of you who stuck around. I will be sending a follow-up email with a link to a survey. So if you will just take a few minutes to take that survey, I would greatly appreciate it. And again, the full reading list for the Suffrage Centennial Book Club is on the link, in one of the links that I sent in the email you received today before our book club meeting. Again, thank you all so much. Bobby, is there anything you want to add before I go ahead and end today's meeting?
No, just be on the lookout in the next few weeks. Nashville has canceled some of their events. The pandemic is surging in Nashville, in Tennessee, more than it is in Texas now, I think. And it's a shame. We possibly might be going to Tennessee, and if I do, I'll probably go to Centennial Park where the statues of some of the women are. There's a picture of that in the book. But I think other events have been postponed for now. But still, be mindful of it when August rolls around. So it's I'm so sad that the pandemic is
it's hampered all of our
curtailed a
plans.
lot of these events. Yeah, it's made me sad. So it's not getting the attention it deserves.
And Bobby mentioned Centennial Park, and I just want to point out that the author's website is linked to on the LibGuide, and you can go and view a full gallery of all the images she references in the book. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay safe and be well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.